Hi, my name is Danny Yeager. I'm a senior at Ohio State. I'm a double major in criminology and psychology with a minor in women's gender and sexuality studies. Today I'm going to be talking about DMST, or domestic minor sex trafficking. It's a very specific form of sex trafficking, and even just more specific in the realm of all trafficking victims, which is one reason why I wanted to talk about it, because it's such a specific area, and it's one of the areas where we're least likely to talk about it. Nobody actually likes talking about trafficking in general, and then we even like to talk about it less when it's domestic on American soil, and even less when it's a minor. Just for a little perspective on human trafficking in the entire world, even though it's really hard to predict exactly how many people are currently being trafficked, the best estimates we have right now are between 12.3 million and 27 million people involved. For a little context, on the low end, that's the entire country of South Sudan, and on the high end, 27 million, is about the entire population of Australia, an entire continent. And we know that about a fifth, 22% of all trafficking victims are children. And we know that for each trafficker convicted, and this is once they actually get through the legal process, those who actually are facing punishment for what they've done, for each one we get to that stage, there are 800 people who are currently being trafficked. It's important for the context of the project that I define what a DMST victim is. It's anyone under the age of 18 within the sovereignty of the United States who engages in a commercial sex act. Now, one important nuanced bit of this is that a commercial sex act doesn't always entail that the person engaging in it is getting paid money. They could be getting paid in food, shelter, or water, or other necessities to live. Before I get too involved into what social workers and the public can do for these victims, I want to talk about the push and pull factors on them. Push factors being things that are pushing them away from a socially approved of life, and pull factors being those things that are pulling them into the trafficking. Push factors very simply include things like poverty, physical abuse, oppression, and desperation. Pull factors, on the other hand, are money, material goods, opportunity, love, visas for traveling, if somehow there's international traveling involved, and even just basic needs such as food, water, shelter, and attention. If one of these victims has been pulled away into human trafficking, there are certain warning signs that we can notice just as the general public, and I want to make sure I get them all right, so forgive me for reading the list, but one thing would be withdrawn body language, especially eye gaze. When I was doing my research, a lot of survivors of DMST trafficking, one thing that they always said was that these victims will always avert their eyes down because making eye contact it's very assertive, and it represents autonomy and being able to do what you want. Like making eye contact with somebody is very powerful, so they're always going to be looking at the ground and trying not to make that contact with people. Other things include, like, if you ask them questions and they have extremely rehearsed answers, probably means that that's what they were told to say, not what they actually think. If they have tattoos or brandings at a really young age, physical abuse, sexual abuse, poor self-image and self-confidence, which kind of makes sense when you think about these victims being around age 12. It's right around when self-identity is being discovered and self-worth is just now being fostered. If they're homeless or runaway, the social deviant, so to speak, they have really nice, expensive things despite having a disheveled exterior. So, for example, if they're walking around and have like 2 or 3 iPhones, then that's probably a warning sign that they can't afford housing, they can't afford iPhones. Another thing would be multiple cell phones. Sometimes they'll have one for their like pimp cell phone and then for their clients or their tricks. If they have really nice nails and their hair is done, but the rest of their physical appearance is still disheveled, they're making an effort to make those things, which seem superfluous to those who are living on the streets, really nice because that's part of their image and thus part of how much money they can make. And last thing would be rapid changes in appearances. Just always trying to change your image and make sure that you're appealing to whomever you have to for that instance. Now, everybody can agree that human trafficking is awful. Nobody's defending it. So my question was, when I started doing this project, was why are people doing nothing? Why is society as a whole so apathetic to helping these victims, often who are 12 and get stuck in it? You know, 77% of DMST victims go into adult trafficking without any intervention somewhere in there. And the thing that I found to be most accurate to what I suspected was that people suffer from fear-induced paralysis. For those of us who have studied crime and criminology, one thing we come across is terrorism, and talking about why terrorism is so effective is because of the fear it installs in people. And I think that it's that same fear that prevents people from doing anything to help these victims. There are two core issues. First off, people have to be made educated and become aware of the issue. We all have heard, that late night article about how somebody's getting trafficked in Rwanda or Bolivia, but we never hear about trafficking right in our hometowns of Columbus or my hometown in Battle Creek, Michigan. But it's happening here, and if people aren't aware about it and aren't educated on the warning signs, then how can we expect change to happen? The other issue is I feel like even for those of us who are aware and who know about these issues, that acting without fear and retribution is a big thing. You have to learn what to say and what to do and how to help these people. You know, one article that I read, it was really inspirational because it talked about saying something is always better than saying nothing. If you confront, a young person who you think is a victim of trafficking and you ask and they're not a victim, that's great. That's another person we know who's safe. And if you're right, well, in a way that's even better because then we have the opportunity and the responsibility to help save that person. It really harkens back to something I learned in one of my psychology classes called the social diffusion of responsibility. It talks about how, like, let's say somebody's getting mugged on the street and there's 20 people around. Well, when you're one of only 20 people, it's really easy to say, well, it was their job to do something. It wasn't my personal job. There were 19 other people. You can share the blame. You diffuse the responsibility between you. And I feel like that's what society as a whole does, is because, it's not my job as one of 6 billion people on the planet to make a difference. There are 5.9 billion other people who should be doing their portion. But if nobody does anything, then nothing's going to change. And I think that's two of the big core issues that are why society is so apathetic to the cause of these children. I figured it would be prudent to talk about the role of social workers within the realm of DMST. And every time I started looking up what social workers do or what their job it is, it always came back to social justice, which is defined as the way in which human rights are manifested in the everyday lives of people at every level of society. It's believing in the worth of a person and giving them their God-given integrity and autonomy for being born. And what I really like about this definition is that it includes the word everyday, which implies that it's the people we see, on the streets, at work, in recreation every single day. It's not about the legislation. We know that there are laws preventing discrimination by gender in the workplace, yet that's still a major issue that feminists and social workers are both working towards. There are two spheres that social workers work in that I wanted to talk about. The first sphere being the public sphere, things that they can do in terms of political activism, like working with policymakers to keep our laws up to date and waking up communities to the issues that are happening right there in their midst. As I already talked about, being so, the society being so apathetic, it's because we're so unaware. And I feel like one of the biggest charges that social workers have is a charge to make people aware of these issues, to force people to recognize the signs and to get involved in their communities to start changing these things. That I wanted to talk about that social workers are involved in is the individualistic sphere, or working with survivors themselves. This is called case management when a social worker handles a specific case of a victim. And I want to talk about a specific case about Sarah Cruzan. She was a victim of domestic minor sex trafficking, and when she was 16, she murdered her pimp. She was originally sentenced to life without parole, but due to the intervention of a couple social workers garnering national attention for the issue, she was granted clemency by Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger, and though it was a long and arduous process, she was only forced to serve 19 years out of her lifetime service, which makes sense considering she was the victim originally, with the systematic abuse, be it sexual, emotional, or physical. Another thing that social workers are regularly involved in is clinical therapy, making sure that once they're able to get somebody out of human trafficking, they're able to give them the resources and the services they need to reintegrate into society, to be a better person, to grow and contribute to society. A question that one of my friends actually brought up to me when I told them that I was doing this project was, what is the role of a social worker should somebody not want to leave domestic minor sex trafficking? And it took me a while before I really was able to research and uncover that, but the biggest thing that I found was that, first off, social workers are mandated reporters, which means that if there's sufficient evidence for abuse, that they're required by law to tell somebody. But that only applies if there's identifying information. If they're just talking to somebody on the street and they don't know who they are, like what their name is, for example, then it makes it hard to mandatedly report on it. And the other biggest thing that I came up with and saw was what's called pre-incident planning or emergency planning, and it basically was to talk to these survivors and victims who are going through trafficking and discuss with them things that they're regularly undergoing. It's talking about, if this happens to you, this is what you can do, or if you feel like your life is in danger at this place, well, these are safe places where you can go. And that was another role that social workers had to contend with, was that not everybody necessarily wants to be saved right now or is in a place to be saved. Let's say that somebody's family is currently being held hostage of sorts, or that they are in fear for their life if they try to flee. Those are all reasonable causes why somebody would consider staying in domestic minor sex trafficking that social workers regularly have to contend with. Now, of course, through this project, I watched lots of interviews with social workers involved in them where they were asking some of the same questions I was asking in my research. And one interview that I really wanted to focus on was a woman named Celia Williamson. She was asked, "Why are you involved in social work?" And she had a really lovely quote that I wanted to include in here, and it was to protect the vulnerable, poor, and oppressed by focusing on genuine relationships. And I thought that that was really inspiring and really the epitome of what social workers do and what social work means. It's the desire to make change and to do right by those who don't have a voice. And as she said in one of her interviews, the voice is a muscle. Yeah, it's shaky at first, but the more you get used to speaking and the more you get used to standing up for people, the stronger it becomes and the more effective you as a social worker or as just a global citizen become. Now, there are just a few other things I want to touch on before I conclude my presentation, one of which is discussing rape culture, diversity, and intersectionality. Rape culture is the concept that men and women are both treated extremely differently based on their sexual preferences and basically how often they have sex. The difference between a man who has lots of sex being a player and a woman being a slut, and how that plays into minor trafficking, and the stereotypes associated with that. I feel like when people think about domestic minor sex trafficking specifically, it's easy to rely on negative stereotypes around, the social deviant, or like their parents failed them, or like, oh, it's just being the reckless phase, or oh, she's just being a little, slutty. Not that I advocate for those things, but I feel like it's important that we address the biases that we as a society might have against these victims and really dismantle rape culture, because I feel like it's important when discussing these victims and how we can help them that we have to be aware of our own biases against them. And that's where intersectionality really comes into play too. Intersectionality is where two statuses intersect and the unique things that occur at that intersection. For example, I am both white and a man. So at the intersection of white and man, what are the things that I experience? As opposed to, let's say, a woman of color. As a woman, well, we know about like the gendered wage gap and the things that women are faced with. And then we know that things that African Americans and the black culture are faced with. So it's the intersection between black and woman versus how it's different between like my intersection at man and white. And I feel like it's really important to know and understand those biases as well, and the specific resources or services that those in those sections need, like the LGBTQ community, for example. They're far more likely to be involved in trafficking and homelessness, so it's a community that we're likely to see involved in this, and it's another group that we need to pay attention to and have resources specifically available. And on a slightly happier note than the rest of the presentation, I want to talk about how we can fix things and how we can change this issue. Not just social workers, even though they play a key and integral role in this, but what we as a general populace can do. And the big thing is implementing training. We need to make people aware of this issue, and we need to teach them what to do. I was reading an article earlier today about how truck drivers and hairdressers specifically are both great resources for identifying these victims, because truck drivers are all over the place and truck stops are so highly populated by people who are prostituting or human trafficking victims. And hairdressers, because they're the ones who are, doing the hair of these young victims, and it offers the opportunity to start a dialogue like, you look like you don't have a place to live, but you're able to afford to get really nice haircuts or whatever they're getting, whatever services are being provided. And I feel like everybody in their own life has the opportunity to educate themselves on these issues, even if it's just re-listening to the list of symptoms and warning signs that I talked about earlier, or taking 5 or 10 minutes to research the topic on your own. This isn't an insurmountable issue. Yes, human trafficking globally is a $30 billion industry, making it one of the largest criminal networks in the world, but it's not insurmountable. It's something we can all start fixing in our communities now. It's not just happening in Chicago. It's not just happening in New York. For example, Ohio is the 5th biggest state for human trafficking, and it's Midwestern Ohio, But there's a lot that everybody can do in their lives, and it's small changes. So I would encourage you to do your own research or to just re-listen to this presentation and educate yourself on what you can do and learn the warning signs, because you never know when you're going to come into contact with one of these victims and the change you can make in somebody's lives. I want to conclude this by saying thank you to Professor Mesh Lamaya for having me in your class. I'm not a social work student, as I previously said, criminology and psychology, and learning from the new lens of social work has been a rewarding experience. And for everybody who's watching this on social media, I want to say thank you for finishing this with me, and have a wonderful day.